My husband forced me to cook for 30 guests on a shattered leg while he lounged by the pool, but his own mother was about to make him regret every single second of it. The cake stand cracked down the middle, and 30 guests went dead silent. I was on the floor before I understood I was falling. My crutch had skidded on a wet patch near the sink. My cast caught the leg of a folding chair, and my whole body twisted sideways. The fresh break in my tibia screaming somewhere under 6 weeks of healing that hadn't finished healing. Someone's arms closed under mine and held me up before I hit the tile. It wasn't my husband's arms, it was his mother's. Gavin got there half a second later, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the wreckage on the floor. 4 layers of salted caramel cake, split open, frosting spreading in a slow tide toward the baseboards. Is it ruined? He asked. Not, are you okay? Not, what happened? Just the cake. Sylvia's arms tightened around my ribs. She didn't answer him. She turned her whole body toward me instead, like he'd stopped being the person in the room worth speaking to. How long has he been doing this to you? She asked. I didn't have an answer ready. I'd spent 3 weeks convincing 30 people and myself that everything about that kitchen was fine. To understand how I ended up on that floor, you have to go back 6 weeks, to a Tuesday in June and a porch step Gavin had promised to fix in March. I was 34 that summer. Gavin was 37. We'd been married 6 years, together 8, in a single-story colonial on Cypress Hollow Drive in Westerville, Ohio, 15 minutes from where he grew up. I worked as a compliance analyst for Meridian Mutual Insurance in the Disability Claims Audit Division. My job was reading files where people said they were hurt and deciding whether the paperwork backed them up. I was good at it. I noticed inconsistencies other people missed. A date that didn't match a receipt. A signature that leaned differently on page 4 than it did on page 1. Gavin used to joke that I couldn't watch a movie without pointing out a continuity error. He meant it as a compliment, back when he still meant things as compliments. Gavin was a senior loan officer at First Concord Bank, 3 years into angling for a promotion to branch manager, a decision his regional VP, Don Presley, was set to make sometime in September. The promotion came with a $22,000 raise and more than that, with the kind of status Gavin had wanted since I'd known him. He measured his life against people he'd gone to high school with. He kept a mental ledger of whose house was bigger, whose wife hosted better parties, whose kids went to which schools. I used to find it almost sweet, this hunger to be seen as someone who'd made it. I didn't yet understand what he was willing to spend to get there. The pattern went back further than the marriage, if I'm honest about it. When Gavin proposed on a Friday in April at a restaurant in the Short North, he told me 2 weeks later that the ring had wiped him out for the quarter and asked whether I'd mind covering the deposit on our engagement party venue. Just this once, just until his next commission check cleared. I minded. I paid it anyway, $450 on a card I was still carrying a balance on from grad school, because refusing felt at the time like making a fight out of something small. It wasn't until years later, going through old bank statements for the divorce, that I found the commission check in question. It had cleared 11 days before he asked me to cover the deposit. His mother, Sylvia, was 63. She'd raised Gavin and his 2 siblings, Denise and Mark, mostly alone after their father, Frank, died of a heart attack when Gavin was 15. Sylvia worked 2 jobs for years afterward, days at a dental office, evenings doing the books for a landscaping company, and she almost never talked about it unless you asked directly, and even then only in pieces. Once, at a Thanksgiving early in our marriage, after 2 glasses of wine, she told me she used to cry in the pantry most nights, quietly, so the kids wouldn't hear. Nobody noticed, she said. Everyone just assumed she was managing, because she never let herself look like she wasn't. I remembered that conversation for years without understanding why it mattered. It would matter a great deal later. Frank, from everything I gathered over the years, hadn't been an easy man to be married to either, though nobody in the family said so directly while he was alive to hear it. He'd run a small auto parts distributorship out of a warehouse off Route 3, kept the family finances entirely to himself, and expected dinner on the table at 6 whether or not Sylvia had worked her own shift that day. Denise told me once that their father used to say, half joking, that a house only needed one person's opinion in it, and everyone understood whose opinion that was. Sylvia had spent 30+ years absorbing that arrangement and calling it normal, and when Frank died, she'd raised 3 kids inside the only template she'd ever been handed. I didn't understand, that first Thanksgiving, that I was looking at the raw material Gavin had been built from. I just thought she seemed tired in a way that had nothing to do with turkey. My own mother, for what it's worth, had modeled something closer to the opposite. She'd divorced my father when I was 9 over exactly this kind of quiet erosion, and raised me with a running commentary on the difference between someone who forgets to help and someone who's decided, somewhere below the surface, that helping isn't their job. I used to think I'd inherited her radar for it. It took Gavin 8 years to prove me wrong, mostly by being patient enough that I never once caught him in a single moment large enough to trigger it. Gavin had been the oldest, and by his own account, and Sylvia's, the one who'd taken his father's death the hardest and gotten the most accommodation for it. Denise told me once, dry as anything, that their mother had spent 2 decades excusing behavior in Gavin she'd never have tolerated in Denise or Mark. He didn't do a dish until he was 26, Denise said, and he still thinks that's a personality trait instead of a debt. I met Gavin at a conference in Cincinnati in October, 8 years earlier. He was charming in the specific way people are charming when they've never had to try very hard at it. He remembered small details about my week, texted good morning for the first year, told me I was the most competent person he'd ever dated. Like competence was a rare and impressive gift I'd handed him. I liked being appreciated for the parts of myself other people had overlooked. It took me a long time to notice that being appreciated for competence just meant I was expected to handle things. The first real warning came 2 years before the party, in February, when I got pneumonia. High fever, 103 for 2 days straight, a cough that left me doubled over. Gavin had a golf trip already booked with 2 clients in Hilton Head, 4 days, non-refundable. I told him I understood that he should go, because at the time I still thought understanding was a virtue instead of a habit. He went. He also told his coworkers and later his mother that I had insisted he not cancel, that I hadn't wanted to be the reason he missed it. That wasn't what I'd said. I'd said I understood. There's a difference between releasing someone from guilt and inventing a story where you beg them to go. I found out about the second version secondhand from Sylvia, who mentioned how thoughtful it was that I'd pushed him to go have fun while I was so sick. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, trying to decide whether correcting her was worth the fight it would start. I decided it wasn't. That was the first of many times I decided a fight wasn't worth having, and each time the cost of not having it got quietly added to a ledger I didn't know I was keeping. There was a smaller pattern too, one I'd never bothered naming because on its own it seemed too minor to matter. Every year around tax season, Gavin handed me a shoebox of receipts he'd meant to organize and hadn't, usually the week before the filing deadline, usually with some version of, "You're just better at this stuff than I am." I was better at it. I was also by then doing our taxes, managing our calendar, remembering his mother's birthday and his dry cleaning pickup, and the dates his own doctor's appointments needed rescheduling, and somewhere in the accumulation of all of it, better at this stuff had quietly become responsible for all of it, a transfer of labor so gradual I couldn't point to the day it happened. I used to tell myself this was just how marriages divided tasks, that every couple had a spreadsheet person and a big picture person. It took the porch step and everything after it to show me the difference between dividing labor and simply being handed all of it by someone who'd learned, a long time before he met me, that someone else would always eventually pick it up. By the time June came around, we'd settled into something that looked, from a distance, like a normal marriage. We split bills. We went to his mother's house on Sundays. We hadn't had children yet, something we'd agreed to revisit after the promotion, a phrase that had started to feel like a door that kept sliding 6 months further away every time I reached for the handle. The porch step had been loose since the previous fall. I'd mentioned it to Gavin in March, after I felt it give slightly under my foot. He said he'd get to it. I mentioned it again in April. He said the same thing, this time with a flash of irritation, like I was nagging him about something trivial. In May, I stopped mentioning it, filed it under things I'd eventually just do myself once my hands were free on a Saturday. On the second Tuesday in June, I came home from work a little after 6, arms full of grocery bags, and the step gave way completely under my right foot. I don't remember the fall so much as the sound, a crack that didn't feel like it belonged to a piece of wood, and then one that very clearly belonged to me. The ER doctor at Riverbend Medical Center, a calm, unhurried man named Dr. Whitfield, showed me the x-ray himself. Spiral fracture of the tibia, clean but unstable. 6 weeks non-weight bearing, he said. Crutches only. 0 weight on that leg. Or the bone could shift and the healing timeline could double. Someone needs to take over the physical side of your life for a while, he told us both, looking between me and Gavin. Groceries, meals, getting around the house, all of it. That's me, Gavin said, and squeezed my hand for the doctor to see. For 2 days, he meant it. He got me water without being asked. He cooked eggs badly and served them like an accomplishment. By day 3, the coffee stopped showing up before I asked for it. By day 5, he asked almost idly, over dinner, when I thought I'd be back to normal, the way you'd ask about a flight delay, checking whether the inconvenience had an end date attached. I didn't know yet that the real test wasn't coming from the small daily erosions. It was coming from an idea he hadn't mentioned yet, one that had been forming since the day the doctor said the word party wasn't even close to what he meant. But that's the word Gavin was already turning over in his head. His birthday was in 5 weeks. And in 5 weeks, he'd already decided 30 people were going to watch me prove I could still be useful. The birthday party idea came up on a Thursday night, 10 days after the accident, while I was propped on the couch with my leg elevated on 3 pillows exactly the way Dr. Whitfield had shown me. Gavin walked in holding a folded piece of paper like it was a gift he'd wrapped himself. 30 guests, he said, for my birthday. I already talked to Don about it. He's coming. Karen from the branch, the Alvarez account people, your cousin Priya if she's in town. It's going to be good for the promotion, Elena. Optics matter. I looked at the list. Co-workers I'd met twice. Neighbors we barely spoke to. His entire team from First Concord, plus Don Presley and Don's wife. I need appetizers, he went on. Ribs, your salted caramel cake, the one from Denise's wedding. It's my birthday. Can't I want something special from my wife? I told him plainly. Hire a caterer or cut the list. There was no version of the next 5 weeks where I stood at a stove for 6 hours on a leg that wasn't allowed to bear weight. My mother would have managed, he said. It was his favorite weapon, and he reached for it the way other people reach for a phone in their pocket, without even having to look. I'd heard the phrase a dozen times over the years, usually when I pushed back on something. My mother would have managed. Except I knew, because Sylvia herself had told me, crying in a pantry at midnight wasn't managing. It was disappearing quietly enough that nobody had to feel guilty about it. We argued for 20 minutes. Not loud. Gavin didn't do loud. Not with me. Loud was was for people who couldn't get their way by other means. He got tired, sighed a lot, told me I was making this bigger than it needed to be. Eventually, he agreed. Ribs and sides from a caterer. I'd handle 3 appetizers and the cake, and nothing else. I made him repeat it back to me, word for word, the way I'd make a claimant repeat their story back when something in it didn't sit right. Ribs and sides catered. You do 3 apps and the cake, he said, holding both hands up like I was the unreasonable one for asking. I got it, Jesus. 2 days before the party, I found him at the kitchen counter with grocery bags he hadn't mentioned. Slabs of ribs, a case of cabbage, 2 5-pound bags of flour. Didn't order the catering, he said, not looking up from his phone. Copper table wanted $1,800. Ridiculous. You cook better anyway. I already told everyone about your ribs and your cake. That was the moment I understood the negotiation had never been real. It was theater, staged, so that if I refused now, I'd be the wife who ruined his birthday in front of 30 people who hadn't been there for the actual conversation. He hadn't broken the deal in a way I could point to. He'd just quietly made sure the deal never mattered. I stood there for a second considering my options, the way I'd consider a claim file with a hole in it. I could call the guests myself and cancel, but half of them were his co-workers I'd never contacted directly in 8 years of marriage, and doing it now, 2 days out, would make me the story regardless of who'd caused it. I could refuse to cook a single thing and let him scramble, but I already knew how that would be told afterward. The wife who humiliated him in front of his boss over a few appetizers. Every option I could see cost me something. The only one that cost me nothing was the one that would cost him something, and he'd made sure that option had never actually been on the table. You told people I was cooking. On this leg. You're the one who wants to make it a whole thing, he said. It's a few appetizers. People help their spouses. That's marriage. I didn't sleep much that night, not from the leg. From doing math on what 6 hours standing, or sitting, bracing, dragging myself across tile on a desk chair was going to cost my body, and from the particular exhaustion of already knowing no argument I made was going to land. I called my own mother the night before, half hoping she'd offer to drive up from Cleveland and take some of it off my hands. She was 71, recovering from a hip replacement of her own, and she apologized twice before telling me she couldn't make the trip, and I told her it was fine, because it was, because asking her would have meant handing my 71-year-old mother a job that belonged to a 37-year-old man 40 feet away by the pool. I hung up the phone and sat with that fact for a while in the dark kitchen, the particular loneliness of realizing that everyone in your life who might have helped was either unavailable, unaware, or married to the problem. My alarm went off at 4 the next morning. I pushed my old desk chair, wheels squeaking, from the office into the kitchen because Dr. Whitfield had been very clear about zero weight, and a chair with wheels was the only way I could move around a kitchen without breaking that rule. I cooked in timed stretches, 15 minutes upright at the counter, braced on my good leg, then back into the chair until the shaking in my thigh settled. I chopped onions sitting down, holding the cutting board against my stomach like a shield. I made the caramel for the cake 3 separate times because my hands weren't steady enough the first 2, and burnt sugar doesn't forgive shaking hands. Somewhere around 6:30, the muscles along my good leg started to tremble every time I stood, not from weakness exactly, but from doing the work of 2 legs instead of 1, hour after hour, with nothing but a kitchen chair and my own stubbornness for backup. I kept a kitchen timer clipped to my waistband, 15 minutes up, 10 minutes down, and I got so precise about the rhythm that I stopped needing to look at it. My hip ached in a place it hadn't ached before, a deep low pull I didn't have a name for and didn't have time to investigate. I told myself, the way I'd tell a claimant with a borderline file, that pain without documentation didn't automatically mean something was wrong. I didn't yet understand that I was about to become the documentation. By 9, my palms were raw and pink from gripping the counter edge for balance. Gavin came in from the pool a little after that, tan already, wearing new swim trunks I hadn't seen before, and dipped one finger straight into the appetizer dip I'd just finished piping into a serving bowl. Needs salt, he said, and went back outside. A little before that, Carol Presley had let herself in through the side gate to drop off a bottle of wine, spotted me bracing myself against the counter with both hands, and said, brightly, without waiting for an answer, Gavin said you wouldn't hear of anyone else touching the kitchen. I think it's wonderful, honestly, that kind of dedication. I said something non-committal and watched her go back outside, already composing, I assumed, the version of the story she'd repeat to Dawn later that evening. It was the 3rd time that morning someone had walked in expecting to find devotion and found, instead of correcting them, a woman too tired to do the work of correcting a stranger's assumption on top of everything else. Around 10, his brother Mark showed up early to help set up folding tables and stuck his head into the kitchen to ask if I needed a hand carrying anything out. It was the only offer of help I got from anyone that morning who wasn't Ren, and I remember being almost startled by it, the way you're startled by a normal thing after enough time spent without it. I told him I had it handled, because by then saying I didn't have it handled felt like it would cost more than saying I did. By noon I could hear Gavin through the open kitchen window, laughing with 2 friends who'd arrived early to help him set up the string lights. Elena insisted on doing everything herself, he was saying. Total control freak in the kitchen. Couldn't stop her if I tried. I stood very still at the counter for a second, a spatula in my hand, and understood something with total clarity. He hadn't just handed me 6 hours of pain. He'd taken that pain and repackaged it, live, in front of witnesses, into a charming little quirk of mine. If anyone asked me directly whether I was okay, the answer they'd already been primed to expect was a laugh and an eye roll about how I liked things done a certain way. My friend Ren came by around 1 to borrow ice for her own cooler and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway at the sight of my crutches leaning against the fridge, at the desk chair with a dish towel over one wheel, at me gripping the counter with white knuckles to reach the top shelf. He told people at the gate you turned down a caterer, Ren said quietly, that this was your idea. I know, I said. You don't have to make this look normal for him, Elena. I know that too, I said. And that was the part that actually scared me. Not that I didn't know, but that knowing hadn't changed what my hands were doing. Ren offered to stay, to take over the piping bag, and let me sit down properly with my leg elevated the way it was supposed to be. I told her no. I told myself it was because the cake needed a steady hand, and hers had never so much as frosted a cupcake. But that wasn't the real reason, and some part of me knew it even then. The real reason was that if Ren finished the cake, Gavin would have a new story ready by the time the first guests arrived. My friend had to step in because I couldn't manage it myself, poor thing, still adjusting to the leg, and I didn't have the strength that day to watch him rewrite one more thing I'd done. I would rather finish it badly on my own than finish it well and hand him the material. That's insane, Elena, Ren said. You know that's insane, right? I know, I said, for the third time in 5 minutes, and went back to the piping bag. Around 1:30, I went into the office to grab packing tape for the gift table sign and found Gavin at the desk, laptop open, closing it fast enough that the hinge clicked too hard. I caught half a subject line before the screen went dark, something with moving forward in it, and my own name after the dash. Work stuff, he said, already standing, already moving past me toward the door. Boring, don't worry about it. I didn't have the bandwidth that day to worry about it. I had 4 appetizers, a cake, and a leg that had started to throb in a way that felt different from the ordinary ache I'd gotten used to. Sharper, higher up, closer to the break itself. I told myself it was just fatigue. I went back to the kitchen. Around 12:30, once the first guests had actually arrived, and the yard had filled with the low hum of a party finding its rhythm, Don Presley found his way into the kitchen for a beer and stopped to look over the appetizer spread I'd finally gotten arranged on the counter. This is incredible, Gavin, Don said, popping a stuffed mushroom into his mouth before Gavin had even answered. Did you two use a caterer? This tastes professional. Nah, man, I did most of it myself, Gavin said. Easy, one hand already reaching to steal a mushroom of his own. Elena helped with the cake. I've been trying to get more into cooking lately. Stress relief. You know how it is with the promotion stuff. Don laughed and clapped him on the shoulder, said something about how Carol should take notes, and the two of them drifted back out toward the pool deck still talking, already 3 sentences into a conversation that had nothing to do with the woman sitting in a desk chair 6 feet away with flour still dried into the creases of her knuckles. I was 3 feet away, sitting in the desk chair with my leg propped on an overturned crate, close enough that Don could have seen me if he'd turned his head an inch. He didn't. Gavin had positioned himself without seeming to try exactly between Don's sightline and mine, the way you'd block a camera angle you didn't want included in the shot. I said nothing. I'd stopped, somewhere around hour 4 of that morning, expecting my silence to cost me less than my correction would. Sylvia arrived at 1, carrying a wrapped gift, and found me alone at the counter, piping the last of the frosting with my cast propped on an overturned bucket for support. What are you doing, honey? Did he help you with any of this? No, Sylvia. He told everyone hosting was my idea. Something moved across her face, quick and sharp, gone before I could name it. I shifted my weight to reach the top layer of the cake, misjudged the angle, and pain shot up through my leg hard enough that I gasped and grabbed the counter to keep from going down. The doctor told you to stay off that leg, Sylvia said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer her, because right then I needed both hands free to lift the cake stand, and I told her I had it. I could manage the last few feet to the dessert table myself. I reached for my crutch. The tip caught a thin sheet of water pooled near the sink, where ice had melted off someone's cooler. My leg buckled sideways. The cake stand hit the edge of the counter and split clean down the middle. Glass and caramel and 4 layers of 6 hours of work scattered across the tile exactly as Sylvia's arms closed under my shoulders and caught me before I hit the ground. Gavin came running in from the pool deck, and I watched his eyes go straight past me, landing on the wreckage on the floor before they ever found my face. Is it ruined? He asked, staring at the cake. Sylvia didn't answer her son. She kept her arms locked around me, still holding me up on a leg he'd walked past for 3 weeks, still waiting on the question she'd asked before any of this happened. How long has he been doing this to you? I opened my mouth to answer her, and that's when I felt it, something deep inside the bone giving way, a tearing sensation sharp enough to turn the whole kitchen white at the edges, and for a second I couldn't have told her my own name, let alone the truth I'd been protecting for 3 weeks. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Riverbend's ER was a 15-minute drive from the house, and Sylvia made it in 10. She didn't ask permission to take her son's spot beside me. She just took her purse, said, "I'm driving her, someone else can handle the guests," and got me into the passenger seat of her Buick while Gavin stood on the driveway, still holding a paper towel he'd grabbed for the frosting, watching us pull away. He didn't come. Later, he'd say someone had to stay with 30 people in a half-cleaned kitchen, that it made more sense for his mother to go, practically speaking, and there was a version of that logic that almost held together together if you didn't look at it too closely. I didn't look at it closely. I was in too much pain to look at anything closely. Dr. Whitfield wasn't on shift, but the doctor who saw me, a younger man named Dr. Okafor, ordered new imaging within 20 minutes of triage. The fracture had shifted, not from one fall, he explained, easing into the words the way doctors do when they already know a patient won't like what comes next, but from the accumulation of a leg being asked to do things a leg 6 weeks into healing shouldn't have been asked to do. Standing, bracing, small, unavoidable moments of weight transferred wrong, over and over, for hours at a time, for days. The new break needed surgical fixation, a plate, screws, a hospital stay, and a recovery clock that reset back to 0. I lay on the exam table and did the math automatically, the way I did math on other people's claims for a living. 6 weeks had just become 6 more months. Sylvia sat beside the bed while we waited for the ortho consult, and for a long time she didn't say anything at all. She held my hand, which she'd never done before in 6 years of Sunday dinners, and I remember thinking, distantly, through the pain medication starting to work, that her hand was cold and steady in a way that felt like it was holding something back. "I need to show you something," she said finally. "I wasn't going to. I told myself it wasn't my business, but I watched you get carried out of that kitchen, and it became my business." She turned her phone toward me. A photo of a laptop screen, slightly angled, the kind of picture you take fast, without composing it, because you're worried about getting caught. It was an email. Drafted, not sent. Sitting in Gavin's outbox with a red exclamation mark next to the subject line, the same subject line I'd caught half of 2 hours earlier. "Moving forward, Elena," addressed to a family law attorney named Meg Corrigan, a name I didn't recognize, at a firm in Dublin, Ohio, 20 minutes from the house. I read it twice because the first time my brain refused to hold on to all of it at once. He'd written that he wanted to get ahead of things before the September announcement, that Don Presley had made comments before about wanting stable, low-drama people in leadership roles, and that my injury had made things unpredictable at home in ways he needed a plan for. He'd written about documenting incidents, dates, times, a description of me as increasingly difficult since the accident, a version of the last 6 weeks that didn't remotely resemble the 6 weeks I'd actually lived. He referenced an incident log as an attachment. 4 pages, he'd noted, ready to send whenever Meg wanted to see it. He asked her what a clean separation would look like if it needed to happen before the promotion decision, and whether it would look better, professionally, if it appeared amicable and mutual rather than contested. And near the bottom, one line that took the air out of the room entirely. He'd mentioned the porch step. He'd known it was loose since March, he wrote, and while he obviously hadn't caused the accident, he wanted Meg to know, off the record, that the timing had actually worked out, in terms of establishing a pattern he could point to later, if it came to that. He wrote it like a man doing calculations. Not like a man whose wife had a broken leg. Like a man who'd found an angle and was turning it over to see how the light hit it. Further down, he'd asked Meg Corrigan about the house, whether Ohio's rules on marital property would favor him if he could show he'd been the one managing the household during my recovery. A claim so far from anything true that I actually laughed out loud in the exam room, a short, ugly sound that made Sylvia flinch. He'd asked about consultation fees, whether $500 would cover an initial strategy session, and whether it made sense to wait until after his promotion was formally announced, so the timing didn't raise questions at the branch. He had thought about the branch. He had thought about Meg Corrigan's retainer. He had, as far as I could tell from that draft, not once thought about calling an ambulance himself instead of leaving that job to his mother. I handed the phone back to Sylvia and stared at the ceiling tiles for a while, doing the strange math you do when a piece of information doesn't change the facts of your life so much as it changes which facts you're allowed to see. Nothing about my leg was different. Nothing about the last 6 weeks was different. But the story I'd been telling myself about why they'd happened, bad luck, bad timing, a husband who was flawed but fundamentally on my side, had just been replaced with a much colder one, and I could feel the old story leaving my body the way anesthesia leaves it, slow and a little bit like grief. "When did you see this?" I asked her. "Today, around 1. I went into the office looking for tape for the gift bags and his laptop was open. I wasn't trying to look. I saw my own name, Elena, and then I saw yours, and I couldn't make myself look away. You didn't say anything. I needed to be sure it meant what I thought it meant," she said, and her voice cracked on the word sure, the first crack I'd ever heard in it in 6 years. I've spent 30 years telling myself I raised a good man because I was too tired to look hard enough at the alternative. I wanted 1 more hour to be wrong. I thought about the golf trip 2 years earlier, the fever, the version of that story Gavin had handed to his own mother. I thought about my mother would have managed, a phrase he'd used on me a dozen times without ever once asking Sylvia what managing had actually cost her. I thought about a locked drawer I'd tried once, months ago, looking for a spare phone charger, and never thought to try again. I thought about how tidy it all looked from the outside, the loan officer husband, the birthday party, the wife who insisted on cooking, and how much labor it must have taken him to keep that surface so smooth for so long. None of it on its own had been enough to build a case on. That was the part that unsettled me most, lying on that exam table with a new fracture and an old marriage both being reassessed in the same hour. He hadn't done one unforgivable thing. He'd done 100 small forgivable ones, and then quietly written the whole pattern down in his own words, in his own draft folder, as a tool he intended to use against me later, the way way you'd keep a receipt. The ortho consult came and went. Surgery scheduled for Monday. A splint and a stack of discharge paperwork in my lap by the time we walked back out to the Buick a little after 8 that night. Sylvia didn't ask if I wanted to go home. She just drove us both there, jaw set, hands steady on the wheel, like a woman who'd already decided something and was only waiting for the right room to say it in. We got back to the house a little after 8:30. The party had thinned to the stragglers who always stay too long. Don Presley and his wife Carol, still nursing drinks by the unlit fire pit, 2 of Gavin's coworkers folding chairs because nobody had told them to stop, and Denise, Gavin's sister, who'd shown up an hour earlier after Ren texted her what happened, and found herself, without really meaning to, holding a trash bag and picking up plastic cups. Ren was still there too, sitting on the porch steps with her phone in her lap, having refused to leave until she knew how bad the leg was. She stood up the second she saw the splint, and I watched her face do the same thing Denise's would do a moment later, a kind of controlled fury that had clearly been waiting all evening for a reason to stop being controlled. Gavin was in the kitchen when we came through the back gate, on his knees with a rag, wiping the last of the dried caramel off the baseboards, like the floor was the thing that needed tending to. He stood up fast when he saw the splint on my leg, the crutches, the discharge paperwork folded in Sylvia's hand. For half a second, I watched something that looked almost like real fear cross his face, and I let myself hope one last useless time that it was fear for me. How bad is it? He asked. Surgery Monday, new fracture, 6 more months, I said. But you don't actually want to talk about the leg, Gavin. You want to know if I told anyone what caused it. What is that supposed to mean? Sylvia didn't wait for me to answer. She held up her phone, screen facing her son, and said, loud enough that Don and Carol both looked over from the fire pit, loud enough that Denise stopped mid-motion with a trash bag in her hand. Meg Corrigan, Sylvia said, the incident log, the line about the porch step working out in your favor. You want to explain any of that to your wife in front of the people still standing in this yard? Or should I read it out loud for you? The color left Gavin's face in a way I'd never seen before, not in 8 years. That's private. You were in my office. You had no right. I had every right, Sylvia said. I'm the one who taught you how to treat people, apparently badly enough that you thought this was an acceptable way to treat your wife. I get to see how that turned out. Don Presley had gone very quiet by the fire pit, the kind of quiet that isn't the same as not listening. Gavin noticed. I watched him notice. Watched the calculation move behind his eyes even in the middle of falling apart, some part of him still doing the math on optics even now. This isn't the time, he said, lower, glancing at Don. We can talk about this privately. We had 6 weeks of privately, I said. Privately is where you told me you'd fix the step and didn't. Privately is where you agreed to a caterer and bought ribs instead. Privately is where you drafted an email calling me unstable because I had the audacity to fracture my leg on your property. I'm done doing this privately, Gavin. You made it a performance in front of 30 people all summer. You don't get to ask for privacy now that the performance is going badly. I never called you unstable to anyone real, he said. It was a draft. I never even sent it. You wrote it, I said. That's the part that matters. You didn't write it in anger in the middle of a fight and regret it an hour later. You sat down, calm, and built a case against me while I was in the next room on a broken leg you'd known about for months and never fixed. Carol Presley had gone very pale by the fire pit, her wine glass forgotten in her hand, and I watched her replay, visibly, the conversation she'd had with me that morning in the kitchen. Gavin said you wouldn't hear of anyone else touching the kitchen, against what she was hearing now. Gavin, she said, quiet, mostly to herself, you told me she wouldn't let anyone help her. That's not, Gavin started and stopped because there wasn't an end to that sentence that survived contact with the room. Denise set the trash bag down slowly, like she needed both hands free for something, though she didn't move toward either of us. Gavin, she said quiet, tell me she's exaggerating. He didn't answer her. That was, in its way, the clearest answer he could have given. I was protecting myself, he finally said, to all of us, and none of us. Do you understand what it looks like, professionally, to have a wife who's suddenly high maintenance? Don's literally standing right there. This promotion is everything I've worked toward, and I had one summer where things got complicated, and I handled it the way I know how to handle problems. I plan ahead. That's not a crime. I'm not a problem you plan ahead for, I said. I'm your wife. You made ribs for 30 people yourself think that was normal, Ren said from the porch steps, not moving, her voice carrying easily across the yard. You watched her cook on crutches for a week, and the only thing you're upset about right now is that your mother saw the email before you got to send it. Nobody asked you, Ren, Gavin snapped, and it was the first time all night his voice had actually risen. Nobody had to ask me, Ren said. I was standing right there when you told your friends she insisted on doing everything herself. I've got the texts too, if you want to compare notes on what actually happened versus what you told people happened. Don cleared his throat from the fire pit, and when he spoke, his voice had gone flat and professional, the voice I imagined he used to deliver bad news to loan applicants. Gavin, I think Carol and I are going to head out. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I watched Gavin understand, in real time, that the version of himself he'd spent 5 weeks building for an audience of 30 had just collapsed in front of the one person whose opinion he'd built it for. Elena, he said, turning back to me, and for the first time all summer, his voice actually shook. I didn't mean for you to see that email. I would never have actually sent it. You didn't have to send it, I said. You only had to mean it while you wrote it, and you did. I looked at him for a long moment, standing there in the kitchen where I'd bled 6 hours of my body into appetizers he'd taken credit for, and I said said the thing I'd been swallowing for 3 weeks, maybe for 2 years, maybe longer than that. I am done making myself small enough to fit whatever story keeps you comfortable. I'm not managing this for you anymore. Gavin looked around the yard, at Dawn's empty chair by the fire pit, at Carol already gathering her purse, at his sister standing with her arms crossed and his mother's phone still lit up in her hand, and I watched him understand, maybe for the first time in his life, that there was no audience left in that yard willing to accept the version of the story he needed them to believe. So that's it, he said. 6 years, and this is where it ends. Over a cake. It ends over an email, I said. The cake was just the thing that happened to be in your hands when it did. He didn't have anything else to say to that, or if he did, he didn't say it. He went back to wiping frosting off the baseboard because it was, I think, the only task left in that kitchen he still knew how to perform. The days after the party moved fast in the practical ways and slow in every way that mattered. Surgery went ahead that Monday. A plate, 6 screws, and a recovery timeline of 5 to 6 months. Most of it non-weight bearing again. This time with someone other than Gavin managing the physical side of my life. Sylvia took 2 weeks of vacation time she'd been saving for a trip to see her sister in Tucson and spent it instead sleeping on my pull-out couch, refilling my water glass without being asked, driving me to follow-up appointments in a Buick that smelled like peppermint and old coffee. She never once mentioned the trip she'd given up. I found out about it from Denise 3 weeks later, almost by accident, when Denise asked if Sylvia had rescheduled her flight yet, and I had no idea what flight she meant. Ren drove me to the first 3 physical therapy appointments herself before I'd worked out a schedule with Anna that didn't require a ride, and she never once made it a bigger deal than it needed to be. She'd just show up at 7:40 with 2 coffees in the cup holders and ask how my range of motion measured that week, like it was the most normal thing in the world for a friend to become, briefly, someone's whole support system. I told her once in the parking lot after a session that I didn't know how to thank her for all of it. She said I could thank her by never again deciding, on my own, that asking for help cost more than it was worth. I've tried to hold up my end of that. Physical therapy started in October, twice a week at a clinic near the new apartment. A slow and unglamorous process of relearning how to trust weight on a leg that had betrayed me twice already. My therapist, a patient woman named Anna, who never once asked why my husband wasn't the one driving me to sessions, told me in November that my range of motion was ahead of schedule, that whatever else had gone wrong that summer, I'd apparently kept doing the exercises even during the worst of it. I told her that doing the exercises had been the one part of my life that summer that was entirely mine, and she didn't ask me to explain that either, which I was grateful for. I called my mother in September to tell her about the divorce, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "I always thought he looked at you like you were a very good hire." I laughed, a real laugh, the first one in weeks, because it was exactly right, and I'd never once had the language for it myself. Denise didn't waver, not for a single day. She showed up the morning after the party with a legal pad and a list of questions: where the mortgage stood, whose name was on the deed, what Ohio law said about a spouse who'd drafted a document like the one Sylvia had photographed. It turned out she'd spent 4 years as a paralegal at a family law firm before switching careers, a fact I hadn't known until it became suddenly enormously useful. "I'm not doing this as your sister-in-law," she told me, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a mug of coffee she never drank. "I'm doing it because I've seen enough divorce files to know what a paper trail like that is worth, and I want it protected before he thinks to delete it." Mark, Gavin's younger brother, took longer. For the first week, he called it a misunderstanding, told Denise she was picking sides based on one bad email, reminded everyone that Gavin had been under pressure with the promotion. He came around on a Thursday in August, after he asked Gavin directly, over the phone, why he'd written that the porch step had worked out in his favor, and Gavin's answer, some version of, "You're taking that out of context," didn't survive being said out loud to someone who wasn't already inside the story. Mark called me that night and apologized for the week he'd spent giving his brother the benefit of a doubt I hadn't been given in 6 years. He also told me, almost as an afterthought, that he'd offered to help me carry things out to the tables the morning of the party, and that he'd wondered afterward why he'd been the only one who thought to ask. Sylvia's response went further than any of us expected. She'd been quietly covering the difference on Gavin's truck payment for 2 years, a fact none of us knew until she told me, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with the pull-out couch still made up behind her. $310 a month, transferred from her account to his, without either of them mentioning it to anyone else. She stopped that transfer the Monday after the party. No conversation, no warning, and let him find out the way you find out anything you've taken for granted, by its sudden absence. I spent 30 years making sure none of my children ever had to sit in the consequences of their own choices, she told me. I thought that was love. I'm starting to think it was just exhaustion dressed up as love, and I don't have the energy left to keep dressing it up anymore. I filed for divorce in early September, with Denise's help finding a family attorney who specialized in exactly the kind of paper trail Sylvia had photographed. My own employer, Meridian Mutual, processed my short-term disability claim through the same channels I'd spent 6 years working from the other side of the desk. The claims examiner assigned to my file, a woman named Preeti I'd trained 2 years earlier, called to confirm a few details and then said quietly, off script, "I've read your audits, Elena. You'd have flagged half the stuff you told me about your husband before I even finished the sentence." It wasn't a joke, not really. It landed like something closer to recognition. hearing. Mediation happened in a conference room in Dublin on a Tuesday in late November, 6 months almost to the day since the porch step gave out under my foot. Gavin wore a suit he used to save for client presentations, and I understood, watching him sit down across the table, that he was still performing for someone. Even then, even with the audience reduced to 2 attorneys, a mediator, and the woman he'd been married to for 6 years. He tried briefly to argue that the incident log attached to the unsent email had been a private thought experiment and shouldn't factor into anything, and the mediator, a retired judge named Halstead, who did not seem like a man easily moved by phrasing, asked him to explain what a thought experiment was doing addressed to a divorce attorney with a subject line and a proposed fee structure. Gavin didn't have a good answer. He signed what needed signing 40 minutes later, and the whole marriage came apart in the amount of time it usually takes to get through a dentist appointment. The house took longer to sort than the marriage did. Gavin wanted to keep it, argued that he'd covered more of the mortgage over the years, a claim that unraveled fast once Denise pulled the actual account records and found that Sylvia's $310 a month had been quietly propping up his half for 2 years running. Once that math was visible, the negotiation changed shape. We agreed to sell. The house on Cypress Hollow Drive went on the market in October and closed in December. The equity split, according to a formula our attorneys worked out that I understood professionally better than either lawyer did. Word moved fast through First Concord's Westerville branch, the way it always does in offices small enough that everyone knows everyone's spouse by sight. Karen, the coworker Gavin had invited to the party, stopped returning his lunch invitations by August. 2 of the friends who'd helped him string up the lights that morning, the ones I'd overheard him laughing with through the kitchen window, quietly stopped inviting him to their Sunday golf group by the fall, a fact Mark mentioned to me almost apologetically, like he wasn't sure whether I'd want to know that Gavin's world had gotten smaller. I did want to know. Not out of vengeance exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that in it. Mostly I wanted proof that the version of events he'd performed all summer hadn't survived contact with people who'd actually watched it happen. Gavin's desperation showed up in smaller ways after that, the kind that don't make for dramatic scenes but stack up regardless. He texted at 11 at night, then 2 in the morning, then not at all for a week, then again. He asked Ren to talk to me on his behalf, which Ren declined to do in terms I won't repeat here. He told a mutual friend at a barbecue in July that I'd blown one bad decision completely out of proportion, a version of the story that made its way back to me within 48 hours, the way these things always do. He asked Sylvia, more than once, to tell me it had all been a misunderstanding, and each time she told him the same thing. She wasn't going to lie for him anymore, not even a small lie, not even for peace. He showed up at my new apartment once, unannounced, in late October, standing in the parking lot with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and an expression I recognized from the early years, the one that used to work. I didn't let him pass the front step. He told me he'd been seeing a counselor, that he understood now how the summer must have looked from where I was standing, that he wanted one real conversation, no lawyers, just us. I asked him if the counselor knew about Meg Horrigan's email, and he didn't answer, which was, by that point in the year, an answer I'd learned to read fluently. I told him to leave the flowers on the step if he wanted, and I'd put them out with the recycling, and I closed the door before he could decide whether that had been a joke. Don Presley never gave Gavin the promotion. Nobody told me this directly. Gavin certainly didn't. But Denise heard it from a mutual acquaintance at First Concord, and by October, Gavin had quietly started looking at branches in Cincinnati, 120 miles from Westerville, from his mother, from the version of his life that had assumed everyone would keep absorbing whatever he decided to hand them. There was a night in November, packing the last of my things out of the house before the sale closed, when I found our wedding album in a box in the garage, water-stained along one edge from a roof leak nobody had ever gotten around to fixing. I sat on the concrete floor of that garage for a long time with the album open on my lap, looking at a photo of the 2 of us on a dock somewhere in Michigan, 4 years before the porch step, before the pneumonia, before any of it. I didn't cry so much as go very still, the way you go still around something you know you can't argue your way out of feeling. I had loved a version of him that either never fully existed or had been slowly replaced, piece by piece, by a man who did math on my injuries. Both of those things could be true, and mourning one didn't require pretending the other hadn't happened. I let myself sit with that for as long as it took, and then I closed the album, put it in the donation box instead of the keep box, and went back inside to finish packing. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Dublin now, 20 minutes from Cypress Hollow Drive, close enough to Sylvia that we have dinner most Sundays, a tradition that used to belong to Gavin's side of the family and now just belongs to us. My leg healed straight eventually, though I still feel the plate on cold mornings, a small permanent reminder wired into the bone. I got a promotion of my own that spring, into a senior auditor role at Meridian, reviewing the kind of complex claims files that used to go to people with more seniority than I had. Pretty tells people when the subject comes up that I have an unusually good instinct for spotting a story that's been rewritten to look cleaner than it actually was. I never correct her about where that instinct came from. Sylvia and I talk most days now, not out of obligation, but because somewhere in that kitchen, holding me up on a broken leg, she decided to stop managing her family's comfort at the expense of the truth, and I decided the same thing about mine. She still carries guilt about the $310, about 22 years of quietly excusing behavior in her oldest son that she'd never have tolerated from anyone else. I've told her more more than once that raising someone doesn't make you responsible for who they choose to become at 37. She hears me. I don't think she's fully forgiven herself yet. Some things take longer than a single conversation to metabolize, and I've stopped expecting her to rush it. Gavin moved to Cincinnati that December, took a lateral role at a smaller bank, and married someone new 18 months later, according to Denise, who still checks in on him out of a loyalty I understand, even if I no longer share it. I hope, in the plain and complicated way you can hope something for a person who hurt you badly, that he's found a version of himself that doesn't require anyone else's body to be spent in service of how he looks to a room. I don't know if he has. It isn't really my business to know anymore, and there's a real relief in that not being my business. Priya, my cousin, ended up moving to Columbus the following spring for a job at Ohio State, and she stayed with me for 6 weeks while she found an apartment of her own. She'd been at the party that day, one of the 30 faces in the yard, and she told me once, late one night over wine, that she'd noticed my crutches and almost said something, and then decided it wasn't her place. I told her what I'd started telling everyone who confessed some version of that same regret. Denise, Mark, even Ren once on a bad night, which was that the not saying something hadn't been anyone's failure but Gavin's, and for longer than I like to admit, mine. People believe the story they're handed unless someone hands them a better one. For most of that summer, I was the one handing it out. I still cook, sometimes for a crowd, but only for people who'd carry a chair across a room for me without being asked twice. Ren hosts a dinner every few months where I make the salted caramel cake, the same recipe, and nobody has ever once asked me to bring it on crutches. Last month, I made it standing at my own counter, on 2 working legs, for 8 people who all got up at the end of the night and helped me clear the table without a single one of them needing to be told. I think about that kitchen on Cypress Hollow Drive sometimes, the cake stand splitting down the middle, 30 people going quiet at once. For a long time, I thought that was the worst moment of that summer. I don't think that anymore. The worst moment was every quiet week before it. All the small negotiations I made with myself about what was worth a fight and what wasn't. All the times I decided my own pain could wait until it was convenient for someone else's schedule. The fall was just the moment the bill came due, and it happened, by the strangest kind of grace, to come due in front of the one person in that family who still had enough left in her to change what she was willing to excuse. Sometimes, on a Sunday at Sylvia's new place, a smaller house closer to Denise's on the north side of town, I'll catch her watching me across the dinner table with an expression I can't fully name, something between pride and apology, and I've learned not to ask her to explain it. She's earned the right to a feeling she doesn't have to justify to anyone, least of all to me. We don't talk about Gavin much anymore, not because it's forbidden, but because there's genuinely less and less to say. He is, as far as either of us knows, fine, building a new life 120 miles away the way people do. I hope that life asks less of the people in it than the old one did. I'll probably never know either way, and I've made my peace with that particular unknowing. I don't regret the marriage entirely. I regret how long it took me to understand that a man who lounges by the pool while you cook for 30 guests on a shattered leg isn't showing you who he is by accident. He's showing you exactly who he's always been, and daring you to keep calling it something else. I stopped calling it something else. That's the whole story, really. Not a happy ending, not exactly. Just an honest one, which, after that summer, turned out to be the thing I wanted most.